Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, which features stories from the oral history website, voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life story for present-day listeners and for the generations to come. Our entire collection is available at voicesofoklahoma.com. By subscribing to our podcast, you will be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. So now listen to another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com.
Donald E. Prey reached many goals by graduating from Tulsa Central High School in 1950, graduating from the University of Tulsa in 1955 with a degree in petroleum engineering, and graduating from the University of Oklahoma School of Law in 1963. The law library at the University of Oklahoma was named for him thanks to a gift from the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation, honoring Don Prey's service to the foundation as its first executive director and then as a longtime trustee. He was a founding partner at the Prey, Walker, Jackman, Williamson, and Marler law firm. Don was one of the founding trustees of the Grace and Franklin Burnson Foundation and has also served as a director or trustee of St. John Medical Center, the University of Tulsa, Philbrook Art Museum, and the Tulsa Ballet Theater. These major accomplishments by a man who grew up in a garage. It has been written about Don that his life has been rewarding, not because of what he has received, but because of what he has been able to encourage others to do. Now you can listen to Don's interesting life story on voicesofoklahoma.com.
My name is John Earling, and today's date is June 5th, 2014. Don, state your full name, your date of birth, and your present age, please.
I am Donald Eugene Prey. I was born January 16th, 1932. I am 82 years of age as we meet here today. I was born in Morningside Hospital, which no longer exists. It's a building on North Cheyenne, about 6 blocks north of Archer.
I've never heard of anybody whose last name is Prey. What's the story behind that?
The name Prey, I'm not sure of its origins. My dad was one of 7 children. He was born in Muskogee. By the time that I was aware of any family relationships, his father had left his mother, and Beatrice Prey had been a Jackson. So I don't know the history of the Prey name at all. There was one other Prey family here in Tulsa, and he was the guy who started the Cord automobile rebuilding, but he was no relationship to our family.
About your father, what was his name, and describe him a little bit?
He was Clyde Elmer Prey. He and my mother, who was Ruth Frank, both graduated in 1925 from Tulsa Central High School. They both attended Phillips University in Enid. My father graduated with a degree in divinity and was an ordained minister of the Disciples of Christ Church. He attempted to establish a ministry down in Lawton, Oklahoma. He was kind of a circuit rider, but back in the day, the Depression had hit, and it was very difficult to sustain a family trying to be a circuit riding minister. So he came back to Tulsa and got a job with Sunray DX working in the refinery, and spent the rest of his life working in the refinery. His entire life he did shift work. He worked moving shifts. He would work 3 to 11 at night, and then the next week he would work 11 till 7 in the morning, and the following week then he'd work 7 until 3. That's the kind of life he had his entire life. I grew up having to adjust to those type of shifts in a very small home.
And then your mother's name?
Ruth Annette Frank. She was raised by her grandparents as her mother died in childbirth with my mother. She had a grandmother, Frank, who lived at 1331 South Owasso here in Tulsa. That's now the site of the Broken Arrow Expressway.
Describe her personality and her raising you.
Well, Mother was a very bright person. She was a would-be author. She wrote things for publication in later life. But she worked for a doctor, S.C. Shepard, during my years that I grew up. She was the first president of the Tulsa County Medical and Dental Assistance Organization. So she was a very bright, aggressive person. She continued to learn throughout her life. While I felt my father really didn't have any interest much in learning, he did his work at the plant and played a lot of golf. He was an excellent golfer. During his later years, he became a state seniors champ in golf. But Mother, as I say, continued to do writing. She wrote short articles and sent them into magazines and occasionally would get paid for them. In her later years, when she was at the Broadmoor Retirement Village, she wrote a weekly newspaper for them. And prior to that time, as a member of Eastside Christian Church, she wrote a column in the church paper called The Church Mouse. I guess I got some of my interest in writing from her.
I was going to ask you then, because you became accomplished as an attorney and all, did you draw from both of them or mostly maybe from your mother?
Mostly from my mother, because she was the one that challenged me to read. I loved reading from the very beginning, and I guess in my early days I read a lot of Reader Digest magazines to improve my vocabulary, and I just loved books, loved to read.
Did you have brothers or sisters?
I'm an only child.
Describe to us the first house that you would remember living in Tulsa.
Well, the very first house I can remember was a small house just off of Admiral and Lewis, and it was on the grounds of St. Francis Church. From time to time, I used to wander over into the school at St. Francis, and the sisters would call my home and tell my mother that I was there. Would they please come get me? From there, we moved into quarters at my great-grandmother's house at 1331 South Owasso. We lived in the servants' quarters. It was a one-room arrangement with only a bathroom and a hot plate. The next house I remember, we moved down to Brookside on 36th Place and lived in a duplex there. And I don't remember much about that except that Brookside was highly underdeveloped at that time. It consisted of a drugstore, a market, a Safeway store, and a Crawford's drugstore.
So this would have been about what time?
This would have been, it was during the time that I was at the end of my first grade, and I had gone into Elliott School.
So we're talking 41, 42, somewhere in there.
Yeah, probably 1940.
Okay.
Because I remember 1941, my father had acquired 2 lots at 37th Place in Norfolk, and he proceeded to build a house. He had plans to build a larger home on these 2 lots, but in order to proceed, he built a garage that was 20 feet by 20 feet and had garage doors on one side and an entry door on the other. And we actually lived in that house. It was divided into 2 rooms, each room being 10 feet by 20 feet. I lived in the kitchen side of that house, which had a table and chairs and an army bunk. That was my room. I lived across from the bathroom. The other side of the house was a bedroom for my folks and a living room combined.
You referred to your grandmother. Talk about your grandmother, and I think it would be great Aunt Ruby, because you talk about their living conditions in the icebox. I think it would be good to hear about that.
It was my great-grandmother, Frank. She was from England, and she had married a Jewish man who I think was French, thus the name Frank. They lived in what I considered to be a mansion. It was really a 2-bedroom home with lovely furnishings, and my Aunt Ruby, who was my great-aunt, was Secretary of Public Service Company of Oklahoma. She had a very high-placed job and was extremely well thought of as a business lady. They had things such as a record player, which was an old Philco radio and record player. I loved to go over there and play records. And they had something called a Viewmaster, which was something you'd look through and it would give you in-depth vision because it was 2 pictures that you would see at the same time. One of the things that I particularly remember about my grandmother's house was that they still had an ice box, which was literally cooled by ice. And they used to have a card that they would put in the window as ice was delivered on the street. On the card, it would say 50, 25, 100, and I don't remember what the fourth side was, but the side that you would turn up would tell them how much ice they wanted to have delivered on any given day. And of course, back in the day, milk was also delivered directly to your door. I do remember having the ice box and chipping ice off when you wanted some kind of a cool drink.
As a kid, did you go out to the Iceman when he would come and they might give kids ice?
You had chips of ice that as he would chip off a block of ice, he would also have a few pieces of ice that would stay on the truck, and you could pick it up and have to clean some of the wood from the floor off of it.
You mentioned 1941. Let's talk about December 7th, 1941. You recall that day?
Yes, December 7th, 1941 was a day of infamy for our entire country, according to President Roosevelt. And I remember going to school and talking with the children, and we thought that we would handle those Japs in no time at all. How wrong we were.
And you were about 10 years old then?
I was about 10 years old then.
Right.
We thought that that was going to be a very short-lived war. As it turned out, my father wanted to get into service, but he was too old to be drafted, and they wouldn't accept him just as a volunteer. So he went to Enid and took flying lessons to where he was able to become a pilot, and then he was of interest to the Air Force, and he did enlist in the Air Force. We moved to Illinois for him to be stationed at Scott Air Force Base and take his first Air Force training. I was entering the 6th grade at that time, and we lived in a little town east of St. Louis called Lebanon, Illinois. Had my dog Buster along with us at the time. We lived there for almost a year, and my first experience with living in an integrated schoolroom was in Lebanon, where we had a couple of black boys, which was a first for me. They were quite a bit older. In the 6th grade, they were probably 15 or 16 years old. It was quite an experience to learn to get along in a classroom with these older boys.
Maybe that helped form opinions for the rest of your life.
Yes, it probably influenced me. I later learned that not all of the blacks were having such a struggle to maintain their role in school as these two did.
Other members of your family, did they get into the war experience as a result of December 7th?
Well, the only one in my dad's family that did was a younger brother named Johnny, who spent his entire life as a military person.
How long did your father see combat as he flew?
My dad, subsequently, after he left Scott Air Force Base, we moved at the end of my 6th grade year to Texas. He was stationed at an Air Force base just outside of Paris, Texas. And we lived in a small town called Reno, Texas. It was probably 10 miles east of Paris and consisted of 2 stores, which were also gasoline stations. We lived in a small home that had a water tank outside the house. They caught water in the gutters and would go into the cistern. So we didn't have in-house plumbing. We had water that we drank out of the cistern. We also had an outhouse. So that was my first experience at living like that.
Let's bring you back to Tulsa then, and the first elementary school you went to here.
I was in Elliott School from the last half of the 1st grade up throughout the 5th grade. Had an amazing group of classmates there, people like Bert Holmes and Jim Lewis, who later became the president of Flintco Construction. Bert's father was a well-known insurance man.
Dan P. Holmes.
Dan P. Holmes, who always came on the radio and says, I want to talk about Highway 33.
Right.
Bert was a dear friend throughout that time and has continued to be my friend until today.
You talk about you went to school at Whittier Elementary?
Yes.
When did that happen?
That was my kindergarten and 1st grade. I was there.
All right. Did you go to movies, and what kind of movies would you see?
Yes, I lived on Xanthus, and I would walk down Admiral to Admiral and Lewis to go to the Circle Theater because they had serial movies every Saturday.
Remember some of the movies you might have seen or stars?
Well, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century was one of the serials, and then later I remember a serial about a Black Panther. It amazed me that we had the freedom to walk down there and nobody ever thought anything about it. It was probably 6 or 7 blocks away. And as I was growing up there used to be a streetcar line down First Street that you could go downtown on. I would go down on Saturday mornings. My mother would work, and I would meet her at Cress's and have lunch there in the basement of Cress's, which had a nice lunch counter. I always look forward to buying a toy at the toy counter there in Cress's.
I would imagine going back to Eliot and Whittier, there must be some teachers' names that you remember to this day.
I don't at Whittier. At Eliot, I certainly remember a woman that kind of influenced my life, Rebecca Cookert, who was a wonderful teacher. She taught my homeroom and taught science and geography. I got in a little bit of trouble because I was moving into the 6th grade. I wanted Mrs. Cookert to also be teaching that class. I began a campaign to get Mrs. Cookert promoted to teaching the 6th grade, and my principal called me in and let me know that that wasn't appropriate for students to be involved in the selection of a teacher. It's interesting, Mr. Jester, who was our principal, had also been a principal when my father was in school at Burroughs Elementary School on the west side of Tulsa.
You've talked about the Brockman Dairy Farm.
Yes, the Brockman Dairy Farm was located at 37th and Peoria, and it stretched down to about 39th and Peoria. They raised dairy cattle. None of the development that there's now was there at the time. There was a DX service station at the corner of 37th and Peoria. The Brockman Farm was immediately behind that, and we lived right across the street. There were cattle grazing right across the street from my house, all the way down to 39th. And at 39th and Norfolk was a radio station with a steel tower that doesn't exist today, but the radio station building, a brown brick building, still exists back in among the houses. It was KOME. I used to wander down there from time to time and talk with the radio engineers, and they taught me Morse code as I was growing up.
Were you a Boy Scout?
I was a Boy Scout, Troop 23 at First Christian Church. I never attained Eagle Scout status, but I was a Life Scout and went to summer camp with the Boy Scouts at Camp Garland for 4 or 5 years. That was the highlight of my summers as I was growing up, is to get to go to Camp Garland.
Then there was a drive-in barbecue place on Peoria.
Yes, there was. It was on the east side of the Brockman Dairy Farm. Of course, we didn't have air conditioning back in the day, and I would open my windows and have a fan at my bedside, and I could hear the live music playing at the barbecue. It was probably about 38th Street and Peoria.
Did you listen to radio much?
Listened to radio a lot. I had a radio right at my bedside and would listen to all the serials in the afternoon. Captain Midnight, Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, Fibber McGee and Molly, the Lone Ranger.
To listen to that and your imagination going had to be a fun time for you.
It was wonderful. I used to listen on Saturday morning to something called Let's Pretend. It was a story for young children. It was the precursor to Mr. Rogers and His Neighborhood.
Then you finished your elementary at Eliot.
I went through the 5th grade at Eliot and then went to Lebanon, Illinois, where I completed the 6th grade.
Okay. How do you come back to Tulsa?
Came back to Tulsa in a very circuitous way. My father was moved from Lebanon to Paris, Texas. From there, we moved to Brownwood, Texas, a little town outside of Brownwood called Bangs. Was there for maybe 2 weeks. Then we moved to Lafayette, Louisiana, and I enrolled in a school called University of Louisiana at Lafayette. I was in teachers training school for about 6 to 8 weeks until my father was transferred back to Brownwood, Texas. From there, he was transferred overseas, and I came home to Horace Mann Junior High in the second half of the 7th grade.
Was that a good experience for you?
It was trying. Everybody in Texas, as you moved from school to school, they wanted to try you out and see what you were. They considered me a Yankee because I came from north of Texas, and they didn't abide Yankees very well in Texas.
But did you do things like have a paper route?
I had a paper route the whole time I was growing up back in Tulsa. As soon as we moved back into Brookside, when my father went overseas, he was sent to the China-Burma area. I stayed at my grandmother's house for approximately a year until the renters moved out of our Brookside home, and we moved back in. When I went back down there, then I started a paper route in Brookside, which I kept throughout the rest of my junior high and high school years. Of course, Brookside was growing rapidly. Apartments were being built. There were a number of apartments built between 38th and 41st east of Peoria. I was the first paper boy to serve those apartments as they were being built.
Is your father coming home from the service in here?
Yes, he came home from the service probably in 1946. He spent several years over in Burma flying these little one-engine planes. They were originally called liaison pilots, but they didn't end up being artillery spotters. The development of the artillery was such that they didn't have to have airplane spotters, so they used them as ambulance planes, and they would fly into very tight situations and load up a wounded veteran and take him back out to a hospital.
Another fun experience for you was the horse that you got, the first horse.
Yes, my first horse was a roping pony named Joe. He was a beautiful sorrel horse. Because Brookside had not developed, we still had wide open fields to the west of our house. Between Norfolk and the river, there was only one home, and that was the home of Jack McLeod, one of my very first boyhood friends. Joe, we would just stake him out in the field to the west of us, and he would graze out there. Loved having a horse. I always loved animals.
You probably could deliver newspapers with him.
I absolutely did. I had a paper route at one time up at 26th Place in Peoria in a very high-class neighborhood, and I think they were startled one time when I rode Joe up there and delivered my route from horseback.
How about sports? Was that important for you?
Sports was probably the most important thing in my life. I began to play softball for the paper station, which was called Station 13, had a team that played against other paper stations.
Paper stations, what do you mean?
Well, the city is divided up into various stations where the papers would be delivered to the station, and the paper boys would pick them up and put them in their paper bags and ride their bicycles in routes all over the city. Station 13 was a station which was at 35th and Peoria. The papers were delivered into the driveway of a filling station and dropped off there, and the boys would go pick up their bundles of papers, fold them up, load them into their sacks, and take off on bicycles to be delivered. Mine was mostly a morning route.
The boys who delivered papers played softball for that team.
Yes. I was a pitcher, and Jack McLeod, my neighbor, was my catcher, and we used to work out a lot practicing pitching and catching. We played against teams usually much better than we were. I was not a great pitcher, but I was satisfactory. We did okay until we went up against a team that had a fellow named Shelby Metcalf, who was absolutely one of the best pitchers in the city. Shelby later became a college basketball star and coached at Texas A&M. It was always a fun thing to go up against somebody as qualified as Shelby was.
On to high school? Which high school?
Went to Tulsa Central High, began to play football, went out for football there. One of my junior high school teachers was a fellow named Leon Fitchman, who had played for the Detroit Lions. He was my homeroom teacher in the 9th grade, and he knew that I wanted to play football, so he took some of his spare time, because he coached at Central too, and helped several of us, including Jack McLeod, get some of the fundamentals of football and how to play line. Leon was was a lineman. He probably was 6'4", 250, 60 pounds, and was just a terrific football player.
Central High, that would have been the class of that you graduated.
The nifty class of 50 from Central High. I played football all 3 years. The first 2 years, I was not good enough to make the varsity team. I played what they call B squad, or junior varsity, and I played guard. Among my classmates were John Eagleton, Eddie Nakarud, John Pollock, Bob Montgomery, Thompson Keenan, Tom Sisson, Joe Seibert, all of whom remain friends to this very day. Playing football together, you become a very close-knit organization. When I was a senior, my first game to start was against Will Rogers High School, which was our big rival. I was very excited to begin playing against Rogers, and we won that game 7-0. That year, our team went on to be undefeated, except we lost one game to Muskogee, and the Muskogee Roughers were the state champions, and they had 3 future All-Americans playing for them: Max Boydston, Kurt Burris, Buddy Burris, and a back by the name of Treadway, who became a star at the University of Arkansas. Boydston and the Burris boys became All-Americans at the University of Oklahoma.
What position did you play?
I played right guard, and John Eagleton played left guard. We were very small. John Eagleton probably weighed 145 pounds. I weighed around 160 pounds. So we were playing against much bigger people. And, of course, teams today, you couldn't even get on a team today weighing that kind of weight.
Socially, then, at Central, where would you go in town and everybody would gather?
Well, by that time, I had bought my first car. I had a 1935 Ford with a rumble seat. I began dating my future wife in the 8th grade, Margaret Morrow. Her nickname was Butch, and that's how she's known to her classmates even today. Butch and I would go to the Quaker Drug, which was at 18th and Main Street, and that was the big hangout for all the high schoolers back then. We went to movies together. There were neighborhood theaters back in the day. The Plaza Theater was at 15th and Peoria. There was a Tower Theater at 11th and Denver. Later on, there was a Will Rogers Theater out east on 11th Street, and the Delman was at 15th Street and Lewis. Movies were one of our main sources of entertainment.
About the stores downtown where you'd shop for clothes and such?
Yes, there was Brown Duncan's at the corner of 4th and Main Street. It had a wonderful restaurant on the 2nd floor, which I remember their lemon chest pie they were famous for. There was a Seidenbach's down on Main Street between 5th and 6th. There was a Vander's at the corner of 5th and Boston. You used to be able to get awfully nice clothes downtown. There was a men's store at 5th and Boston. Sam Brenner's had custom-made suits and sport coats. Of course, I wasn't able to afford that back in the day. There was a store on 6th Street between Main and Boston called Babyland. While I was in junior high, I worked there for some 3 or 4 months. I worked mailing packages and mopping the floors and cleaning the plate glass windows on the front. Later, I worked at Sears, which was about a 10-story building where the One Oak building now is downtown. And I worked on the 10th floor in the warehouse, putting together bicycles and tricycles and toys of that nature.
In the 50s, then, the treatment of blacks in Tulsa, did you see signs posted that blacks weren't invited or could not use restrooms?
Well, what you mostly saw was things like fountains that would say white only. I never experienced integrated schools except in Lebanon, Illinois. There were no blacks in Central High School. They all went to Booker T. Washington.
Did you play them in football?
No. Back in that day, Booker T. was in their own league, and I don't know who they played. We played teams like Muskogee, Okmulgee, Oklahoma City Central, and Bartlesville in our league.
Athletics were important in your life. You said your father was a good golfer. Did you take up golf?
I didn't until I was probably in college. He just never spent the time with me to teach me golf. I went to watch him play from time to time, but I didn't play while I was growing up. Wish I had.
Was there an interest academically beginning to develop as you were in high school before you graduated?
I always liked school. I didn't have a great deal of problems in school. I was able to pretty much do all the work that I needed to do without even having to take work home. I typically, because I played football, had a study hall and would do most of my homework there. I remember vividly there was a teacher who influenced me greatly named Affield Larson. She taught history, and I just loved the course and loved learning from her. There was also a speech teacher by the name of Isabel Ronan. She was very famous for some of the people that had gone through her. Who is the famous reporter, the rest of the story?
Paul Harvey.
Paul Harvey was a graduate of Tulsa Central and had been a pupil of Isabel Ronan's. Tony Randall was also a student of
Now, these
Ronan.
both were older than you, weren't they?
Yes, they
graduated
were.
before
yes,
you
they
did.
Were. I remember one of the things that Isabel taught me, one of the things we always said, a word is dead, some say, when it is said, but I say it just begins to live that day.
That's great. You seem to be a worker bee beyond being a paper boy, some other jobs before you went off to college?
Yes, if I was going to have spending money, I had to develop my own spending money. My parents struggled financially, and the house that my father had planned to build never got built. It was somewhat embarrassing to me to grow up in a garage like I did, so I didn't have a lot of friends over to the house.
How about fireworks? I think you were involved in a fireworks job?
Yes, I always loved fireworks. I used to order fireworks from Spencer Fireworks that advertised in comic books and magazines. I would order an assortment of fireworks every year to shoot off on the 4th of July, and we would have a family get-together at the house because we were one block outside the city limits, so we could set off fireworks, and I always enjoyed those displays. Eventually, I had my own fireworks stand up on Peoria, just south of 37th Street. 37th was the city limits at that time. In fact, the bus lines turned around at 36th and Peoria because there was not much of town south of 36th Street.
Wasn't there a farmer's market, as we call them today?
The farmer's market was between Peoria and Lewis, north of Admiral. There used to be fixed buildings that were like a block long, and there were 3 or 4 of those in that area. And all of the farmers would have stalls and come in and bring their fresh produce. I remember going up there and buying ears of corn and fresh tomatoes and potatoes. It was quite an experience. I know that they're trying to start farmers markets on Cherry Street and in Jenks today, but there's nothing like what we used to have, where all of the people would go at one place.
About cars again. Your first car again was?
It was a 35 black Ford with a rumble seat. The windshield would crank out and the back window would roll down so that you would have air blowing through the car in the hot summertime.
What was your next car?
Next car was a 1940 Chevy Coupe, just a one-seater, and I made the mistake of trying to paint it myself with a paintbrush. And I painted it a bilious blue. It was just awful. But once painted, it stayed that way as long as I had it.
Did people comment on it?
Oh, yeah, the Blue Monster it was called. But I had that until I prepared to get married, and I sold that car, started delivering another paper route in a really exclusive area between 26th and 31st east of Lewis. That's where all the big homes were. That's where the Warren family lived, and people who were really wealthy lived in that area. I threw that for a period of 6 months or so while I was in college and earned enough money to buy a 1950 Ford four-door sedan, and that's the car I had when I got married.
Okay, college. You went where to college?
I went to the University of Tulsa. I really didn't know if I was going to college or not. and I took a test to determine whether or not I was college material, and I did well enough that I got a partial scholarship to the University of Tulsa. The scholarship was for $150, which paid one half of my tuition for a full year. It's just amazing to me to look back and remember that college tuition for the University of Tulsa was only like $300 for a full year. That seems impossible in this day and age.
And then we'll fast forward real quick and then come back again. And then to think that you ended up being a member of the Board of Regents for Tulsa University.
Yes, that's quite a stretch to even think that I could achieve that. When I first went to the University of Tulsa, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So they asked me what major I'd like to select. They said, you know, you're really strong in math and science. You ought to consider engineering. And I said, fine, I'll do engineering. They said, well, we have a great petroleum engineering school. You want to be a refinery engineer or a production engineer? Not knowing what the difference was, I said, well, I don't want to work in a refinery. My dad has done that. So I'll be a production engineer. That's how my major was ultimately decided.
So then your major was?
Petroleum production engineering.
Okay. Something memorable then, those 4 years at TU?
Well, I worked the entire time. I started off working at Farmers and Merchants Bank, and I posted what they call a savings book. I kept track of the activity of people depositing money into their savings. I would take the deposit slips and use a machine to actually post those onto a ledger card and keep track of the savings account. I also handled the mail room and handled all packages and mailing from that. When that job ended, I looked for a job and got a reference to a place called Western Supply, which manufactured refinery equipment called heat exchangers. And I met a gentleman by the name of Jim Hughes. Jim was vice president for Western Supply, and Western was owned by a wealthy man by the name of Wilson Dye. I went to work in the assembly plant. Western Supply consisted of an engineering department that would design heat exchangers, a welding shop that would do welding and fabrication, a machine shop, and then an assembly shop. The assembly shop would take the parts that had been machined and welded and would put them together into a big boiler-like piece of equipment. We would put it all together and then pressure it up with water to determine whether or not there were any leaks and if all the welds would hold. I worked out there on a shift from 3 in the afternoon till 11 at night, and I had my schedule pretty well arranged that I didn't have any afternoon classes. But my grades suffered. My very first semester, I made a straight B average while I was working at the bank. And then with the evening work, my grades fell to about a C+. I think it was a 2.3. I worked out there for a period of maybe 5 or 6 months. And then I had a layoff, and I went to look for another job. Jim Hughes had not intended for me to get caught in the layoff. He called me up and brought me back and introduced me into the engineering department, and I began working in drafting, running blueprints, and doing very elemental drafting. I had not even had a drafting course, but I soon had one after my first year.
Your parents weren't able to help you?
No, I paid for my college all the way through. They said they would take care of me living at home and my food, but whatever books and tuition, I had to take care of myself.
What drove you to have that kind of determination?
Well, I saw what other people did to make a living, and I wanted to be better than just digging ditches or being a carpenter. Like my father's father had been a carpenter here in town and built homes. That's how my dad built our houses. He had learned the carpentry trade, and he could have been a carpenter instead of working in the plant, but I think the plant probably paid better wages. I didn't want to live the kind of life that he had lived, and I was determined to do better for myself.
Yeah. You graduated from TU in what year?
In January of 55. The engineering courses were such that you had to take an awfully heavy load in order to graduate in 4 years. And because I was working part-time the entire time I was in college, I wasn't able to take that full load, so I had to take one extra semester. Fortunately, I did get several scholarships to help along the way. I got a Moorlane engineering scholarship in my junior year, which paid $500, which was, I think, full tuition at the time, and maybe a little extra money. Then my senior year, I got something called a Saucony Vacuum, which is Mobil Oil Company, parent company, and I got a $750 scholarship, which gave me some spending money in addition to books and tuition.
The football era at that time, and I know you didn't play football there, but TU was pretty strong, weren't they, at that time?
Yes, we had some pretty good football teams. We had one fellow who was a tackle. He was an All-American tackle, and Howard Wall was a fullback. I remember the strength of the players. Jerry Cammons, who later became a lawyer, was an end that came down here from New York. Angelo Prasa was a guard. He later became a coach at Bishop Kelly.
Who was the coach at the time?
I think Henry Franca was a coach early on.
Glenn Dobbs came later then.
Glenn Dobbs came later. Henry Franca had coached at Will Rogers when I played against him, but he had become the TU coach at that time.
Again, you graduate from TU in
January of 1955.
Right. Then what is your step?
I received a job offer from Continental Oil Company to go to work for them in the field. I accepted their offer. My first job was to go to Ponca City. I went to Ponca City and worked out in the field, being a roustabout, as they called it, where you would do everything in connection with the well. You would clean up well sites. You would actually pull rods from the well when they had pumping jacks on them. I even, at one time in the summer before I went to the Continental, worked down in the Glen Pool, which is south of Jinx, and I pumped on a central power unit where they used to have one engine that would pump 7, 8, or 10 wells at a time. You had to hook the wells on one at a time. It would connect to this big band wheel, which would work these pull rods. I don't think people can even imagine today what that was like, but it was very interesting to get a chance to work on those kind of wells.
So did you say to yourself ever, I went to college to be a tool pusher?
Well, everybody that I worked with down there kept encouraging me, said, boy, you finished school, don't do like us and have to come out here and work. It was hard work. And it was, 100-degree weather, and we were working out in the wide open spaces with no shelter at all.
But as an engineer, you needed to go into the field to learn that.
Into the field to learn that and learn the basics, because ultimately you'd be spending time in an office figuring out how to drill and complete wells and how to get better recovery from the wells that you had already existing.
You were married in here or something?
I was married. I married in my junior year of college, and my wife worked for an oil company here in town. She worked as a secretary to the head of the geophysical department.
Did you have children from that marriage?
I have children from that marriage. We didn't have children. We later adopted them, much later after law school.
Okay. Law school. You're being a tool pusher, and how do you go to law school?
Well, 6 months into my training program with Continental, I was called up into the service. I had been in ROTC all during college. I received a commission as a second lieutenant in the Air National Guard. I should have received it into the Air Force, but during my senior year, Congress changed the rules, and instead of getting a direct commission into the Air Force, we got a commission into the Air National Guard, and I was supposed to serve 3 years. My first assignment was to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona. My wife and I drove into Tucson. It was 113 degrees. But as they say, it's a dry heat. Had, I think, something like $18 in my pocket and didn't have to report for like 3 or 4 days. We had to make do on that money until we reported and got our first pay. Davis-Monthan was a strategic air command base. As such, it had 2 wings of B-47s and 1 wing of KC-135s, which were tankers that would do in-flight refilling for the wings of B-47s. When I first went into Davis-Monthan, I went through a process where they would decide where to assign you. Being a petroleum engineer, I thought I would probably be assigned to some engineering function. That didn't happen. I was assigned to what is called personnel services, and the subspecialty was called special services. I was given the responsibility for running all of the recreation facilities on the base. I had the base gymnasium, I had a library, I had a movie theater, I had an airman's service club, I had a special services supply which had hunting gear, fishing equipment. I had a wood hobby shop which had every type of woodworking machinery possible. You could build furniture or almost anything in the wood hobby shop. I had a model airplane hobby shop and ultimately had riding stables. Even had a golf driving range, all under my responsibility and supervision. The main thing that I attribute to my time in service is learning how to manage people. For each of these sections had wonderful staff of master sergeants and staff sergeants to run these operations. I learned how to manage people and get the most out of them. And of course, they did all the work, and I simply saw to it that everything ran the way it should and that they had the equipment necessary to accomplish their job.
So as you went on into life and what you have done, which you will get to, you would often draw on that experience.
I went into the Air Force not expecting the level of capacity that the officers and the airmen had. I didn't know what to expect, but I came out with a huge amount of respect for what they did and how they did it. It was a well-run organization, and of course, the Strategic Air Command was being run by Curtis LeMay. He was a tough leader, and he expected nothing but the best out of his people, and he got it. It was really encouraging to see that our military was in the kind of hands that it is.
Did you ever see him in person, Curtis LeMay?
I never did. We had a base commander by the name of Jim Edmondson, who was a very young, good-looking man. He was movie star quality. I really had a huge respect for him. And in later life, I would run into him in Florida, where he was mayor of this little community that I moved to called Longboat Key. I was in a Rotary Club with Jim Edmondson, and I never lost the respect that I had for him. He was just a tremendous individual. One of my experiences that I had in the Air Force is the base commander was one command under General Edmondson, who commanded the base. The base commander was the 803rd Air Base Group. A fellow named Colonel Wimberly headed the base, and he asked me to organize a drum and bugle corps. Of course, I had no musical talents whatsoever, so I went to the University of Arizona in Tucson and hired a music teacher and put out the word on the base for people to volunteer to join the drum and bugle corps. The attractiveness of it was that they would get to wear a special uniform with white spats and epaulets and a white helmet and play in the drum and bugle corps. So we recruited probably 20 or 25 people to play the drums and learn how to play the bugle. This guy taught them, and I taught them drill so that we could march in close order drill. I learned that the reason for the Drum and Bugle Corps is that the base commander, General Edmondson, had been invited for Memorial Day to be the lead of the parade in town, and he wanted us to march in the parade, so we got them up and ready to march, and they learned a couple of drum cadences and one bugle cadence. I even had a drum major trained, and the day before the parade, he was transferred to another base, and I ended up having to be the drum major and lead the Drum and Bugle Corps in this parade.
You were in the Air Force for how long?
I was in for 2 years. Congress saw the error of their ways in drafting us into Air National Guard for a 3-year tour, and they amended the act. So we became part of the Air Force Regular Reserves, and the time was shortened from 3 years to 2 years. I left and went back into the Conoco training program and was sent to Houston to spend time in the headquarters in Houston. Then I was sent back into Oklahoma to Oklahoma City, and then finally went back to Ponca City to spend some time in the engineering research lab, which was located in Ponca City. Then my final assignment was to Ardmore, which is a district office in southern Oklahoma that had the south half of Oklahoma and all of the production therein. And I became a staff engineer, one of 3 staff engineers in the Ardmore office. There, my responsibilities were to study the reservoirs that had already been drilled to see if there was possible secondary recovery, additional reserves, or some way to stimulate the reservoirs in order to gain more production from them, and to look for possibilities of extending the fields to new areas and drill wells. My responsibility was to supervise the program for drilling of new wells and how to complete the wells. I would actually go out on the well site, and as the well was being drilled, run something called a drill stem test, which would enable you to actually open the formation into the drill string and test it to see how it would produce.
And then you also realized how much your work in the oil field, the manual labor, paid off for you, and you could relate to those guys even better, I would imagine.
Absolutely. The time that I spent roughnecking and roustabouting in the field really would pay off because we understood the people that worked in the field, and I had been a part of it, so I appreciated what they did and how they did it. It was really enjoyable, and I liked the work that I was doing. One of the fields that I was assigned was particularly challenging and interesting. It was called the Butterley Field, and it was about 10 miles west of the town of Davis, which is on the north side of the Arbuckle Mountains, maybe 30 miles north of Ardmore. The Butterley Pool was a huge, thick oil sand, approximately 120 feet in depth. It extended over maybe a 40 to 60 acre area, and it was a prodigious producer. But the problem was that the oil itself was a very thick, viscous oil called 10-degree gravity. As you increase the number of degrees, it becomes more fluid. You know, as 40 API oil is the quality of oil that you would put into your car. 10-degree oil is what you would put on your road as asphalt. This particular field produced this asphaltic crude, and it was so thick that it would produce sand from the formation into the tanks. And they had to have the tanks a conical shape so that the sand would go to the bottom, and they could clean that out manually from time to time. And then they would take that thick crude oil and they would truck it out and take it to a site where they would mix it with a much lighter oil to come up with a blend that would flow more easily, because they even had to have heaters on these tanks to make the crude oil sufficiently thin to flow into the trucks.
But while you found this very fascinating, something was working up here.
Well, there was so much oil in place and only about 10% had been recovered, and you would expect in a reservoir of that nature to recover as much as 30%. And I have tried to figure ways to extract more oil from that reservoir because a 120-foot thick formation is almost unheard of in the oil patch. So I came up with an idea. They were doing something called in situ combustion, which was setting formations on fire. This particular formation I didn't think would be susceptible to a fire flood, but I thought that elevating the temperature of the formation might make the crude oil flow out more easily, that maybe a hot water flood might work. And I did some studies to try to see what that would accomplish and made a presentation at an engineering meeting. Conoco was a very enlightened company, and they brought their engineers together annually to meet and talk over new methods of recovery and new ideas that were available to help production. So I did a presentation on the Butterley and hot water flooding. People from the research lab were very skeptical about this. They didn't think it would work. So I just went on about my job and Several weeks later, they called me and said they had had a chance to study possibility of hot water flooding, and they believed that might work. Well, in the meantime, Conoco had decided they were going to move me to broaden my training. They wanted me to go to some place called Carmi, Illinois, which is on the Ohio River just opposite Evansville, Indiana. It was my understanding from people in the patch that it was not a very desirable place to live. And I had loved my time in Ardmore. I had gotten involved in Toastmasters, and I'd gotten involved with the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and I was president of the Junior Chamber. In Toastmasters, I had become involved in speech competitions and had even won a regional speech contest and participated in a state contest, which I did not win, but I felt like I was improving myself as I went along. So at the time they decided to move me to Carmi, I began to look at other possibilities, and I considered going back to law school. So I made a trip home to Tulsa to visit with a gentleman that my wife's family knew by the name of George Bowlin. George Bowlin was general counsel for Sun Oil Company and located here in Tulsa. He was considered to be one of the top oil and gas attorneys in the country. He had actually been hired into the job by J. Howard Pugh in Philadelphia and was very highly regarded. When I talked to George about going back to law school, what I remember him saying is, Don, there's always a place at the top for really good attorneys. I also then visited a friend of mine from the service by the name of Dale Henson, who had left the service and gone to Texas University into law school. And I went down to visit him to see how he was getting along, and he just loved the study of the law. So I made the decision to go back to law school and take a leave of absence from Conoco.
Law school was where?
Law school was at Oklahoma University at Norman. I never considered anything else. At that time, the University of Tulsa was a part-time law school. People went to night school there, and I didn't want to do it that way. I wanted to devote myself to a full course of study. My wife was offered a job in the legal department at Conoco while I took a leave of absence.
This would have been what year?
This was after I'd spent 3 years in Ardmore, and it was in 1960. I enrolled in the fall of 1960.
All right. Was that a good experience? Were you glad you were doing it, or were there days that I wish I'd never done this?
Well, I actually wondered because I was making good money with Conoco, but I had determined that I was going to devote myself to the job, and I was going to do it the way it needed to be done. So we bought a small home in Norman and moved there. I had bought a really nice brand new home in Ardmore. Hated to leave it, but I was going to have to leave it under any circumstance, so that wasn't a factor. When I started to law school, I talked to anybody I could talk to about how to approach law, and they said, read your briefs every day and write out your briefs on paper. So I did one better. I would read my briefs, underline them, and then type out the nature of the case in a notebook. Then I would take copious notes during class, and I would come home and type up my notes every day. And then every 3 or 4 weeks, I would begin to outline my notes so that I would have a running outline of the course. The first semester I did okay. I did like a B+. They graded on a 12-point system, with 12 points being A+, 11 being A, 10 being A-, and I had like an 8.33, so I was a B or a B- my first semester. I had difficulty in one course in contracts that I made a C in. I think that probably was the only C I made in law school. At the end of the first semester, I visited that teacher and got some recommendations on what I needed to do. And I went to the library and read books on how to take tests in law school. And I also learned that you could check out tests from previous years. So I would do that. I was bound and determined I was going to give it everything I had. In the second semester, I did even better. I think it was like a 9.5. I determined I would go to 2 summer schools and cut off a full semester so I could graduate in January of 63. And that summer school, I really found myself and made A+ in both of the courses that I took. And that put me in the top position in the law class. And I maintained that position throughout the rest of my law school time.
So then you graduate in 63.
Graduated in January of 63.
And then?
Well, during the time I was in law school, I was initiated into Order of the Coif, which is the highest scholastic fraternity. I was also invited to write on Law Review. The very first article I wrote was an article on oil and gas. It was called Subsurface Trespass. It was a look at the legalistics of fracking, as we call it today. It was about whether or not when you frack a well hydraulically, that fracture will cross the boundary line of the property and invade somebody else's property. If so, what are the consequences of that? So it's very appropriate for today's controversy about fracking and what is its significance.
You no doubt went back and reviewed that. In this present age, what did you think about your paper then?
Well, I felt even more strongly that it was appropriate that it can cross property lines, but unless it damages somebody else's property, then it's not an actionable tort.
You graduated top of your class?
Graduated top of my class.
That had to bring on law firms that were interested in you.
Yes, I had an offer from an outstanding law firm in Oklahoma City, one of whose members was Eugene Kuntz, who was my oil and gas instructor. He and I developed a very strong relationship. He thought I had a bright future because I'd written this article for him. I just determined that I really didn't want to go to Oklahoma City. I was rather determined to come back home to Tulsa. I saw this as a way to get back to Tulsa, where I love the city. I did get an offer from Amarata, a fellow named Joe Morris, who later became general counsel for Shell Oil Company and also a United States district judge. Joe offered me a job with Amarata, but again, I didn't want a corporate job. I wanted to practice law in private practice and essentially have an opportunity to be my own boss. So I declined that. And a fellow that I had known from high school, who was a classmate of mine named Louis Mossberg, had won all sorts of honors at OU Law School. He'd graduated number one in his class. He'd gone to Oklahoma City and had created a practice of representing people who sold drilling participation units. Louis was recognized as the leading attorney in the entire country in doing drilling projects. He offered me the opportunity to open up a Tulsa office and join George Bowlin, who had retired from Sun Oil Company, come out of his retirement, and the two of us opened an office for Lewis's firm in Oklahoma City.
You opened it here in Tulsa.
We opened that here in Tulsa.
What a thrill that had to be for you to do this with George Bowlin.
George Bowlin was literally a saint, in my opinion. He was a leader in the Presbyterian Church, and during the time that we were together, he was elected moderator of the Presbyterian Church of the USA, which is the highest office any layman can ever hold in the church. George was also a commissioner on uniform laws. He was one of two. The other commissioner from Oklahoma was Maurice Merrill, who was professor of law at Oklahoma University and was considered the leading constitutional lawyer probably in the country. He and George Bowlin to be commissioners of uniform laws, and for me to be in practice with George was just a thrill for me. He taught me how to practice law, and he taught me to avoid the use of legalisms, using the words said, aforesaid, and heretofore, all the legal jargons that so many lawyers lapse into. George taught me to speak plain English and how to communicate without being lawyer-like.
How about that class of 63? Were there some notable graduates?
There really were. Larry Derryberry became Attorney General of the state. He was one of my dearest friends. Andy Coates. Andy and Larry and I were all three on the moot court team which was quite an honor. We participated against other teams in other universities around the country. Andy Coates became city attorney for Oklahoma City. He became mayor of Oklahoma City, and he ran for United States Senate and unfortunately did not win. Don Nichols is the one who prevailed in that race. Andy was the Democrat, and the Republicans were just beginning to take control of the state at that time. So Andy lost. We had also a United States District Judge for the Eastern District. Frank C. was one of our classmates. So we had a dynamite class.
The law firm that you set up in Tulsa, how long did you stay with that?
That lasted for a year, and it really wasn't very successful for them. Louis Mossberg left the firm and joined another firm that was composed of a fellow named Carlton Mosteller and John Andrews. It became Mosteller, Andrews, and Mossberg. And then here in Tulsa, we were known as Mosteller, Andrews, Mossberg, and Bowen. That lasted for a year. And at the time, it just didn't seem like there was much practice that moved up and down the turnpike. George and I were engaged in trying to build a practice here. We began to get some title work from Sun Oil Company and began to get some title work from Marathon. I found that people didn't quickly change their representation, that once they were comfortable with an attorney, that they wouldn't change because they'd rather stay with the devil they knew than move to the devil they didn't know. But we began to make some headway in that. And at the end of 2 years, when the Mosteller firm decided they would not continue to support the office, I met with a fellow who officed in the building where I was. That was the Petroleum Club building, which had been a brand new building when we opened our office in 1963. Jack Kelly had designed and built that building. And a fellow named Gerald Schumann had what appeared to be a very good practice. He had beautiful offices. I went down and visited with him. He offered me the opportunity to join his firm, and he would take George on as of counsel, which means that he just would have an office there and would not be a part of the firm. Gerald offered me a position at less than I had been making with Mosteller, but he also offered me a percentage of whatever business I did for him. I would get a percentage of the billings. I figured that I could make it work out for me. So I joined Gerald, who already had a young man in the practice by the name of John Deas, D-E-A-S, who later became counsel for Sinclair Oil and finally became president of Citibank here in Tulsa.
The firm's name was?
Schumann, Deas, Prey, and Doyle. Stan Doyle had joined the firm shortly after I did, and while we were named as partners, we weren't truly partners. We were employees of Gerald Schumann.
It was while there then the Burnson Foundation came about.
Well, I was introduced to Franklin Burnson by a client named Stephen Pappas, who officed on the same floor as me when we first opened up with the Oklahoma City firm. I met Franklin Burnson, who I later learned more about was one of the people who introduced rotary drilling rigs into Oklahoma with a company called Lucy Products. Lucy Products was an oil rig manufacturer, and Franklin had represented them in the early days of the oil patch here in Oklahoma and had done quite well for them. He had even been a partner with Howard Hughes Sr., who was the father of the Howard Hughes that most people know of, who had Hughes Aircraft. So Franklin Burnson had quite a track record in the oil patch.
Describe him personally and his personality and his looks.
Well, Franklin was a very austere-looking person. He was balding. He probably was in his mid-60s to early 70s. He was very wealthy. He knew everybody and told a wonderful story. It's hard to describe Franklin except to say that he was very quiet and not too widely known. The company that he headed was called Lucy Products. They sold oil field tubular goods and drilling rigs. He had a history in the Oklahoma City field. He's the one that helped get the Oklahoma City field going back in the early days and was responsible for Barnstall Oil Company becoming a leaseholder over there. Franklin became quite wealthy as a result of the Oklahoma City field.
Wasn't there a story when they were not allowed to drill for oil in Oklahoma City proper? And there were many, in fact, the Kerr name is involved in this. They were put off by that, but he wasn't. Tell us then, he had a plan for the Katy Railroad where he could drill under the Katy Railroad. Is that true?
That's true. The Katy land wasn't being leased. There was oil all around the Katy railroads, but they wouldn't lease it. They didn't want their property being drilled up. And Franklin figured out a way to get them to lease to him by finding a source of supply for their diesel oil from Barnstall. He had a relationship with the head of Barnstall Oil Company, and he got Barnstall to supply the railroad with crude oil in return for them leasing these properties to him to drill on, as long as they wouldn't interfere with the railroad's right-of-ways. That turned out to be a very successful venture, both for the railroads, as they got oil for their locomotives at a much reduced price, and Franklin got the chance to extract oil from under their properties, which lay in the heart of the Oklahoma City play.
And nobody else could do it.
Nobody else could do it.
But he was so good looking, I believe, that back in his early days when he lived in California, he got a job in some of the silent movies.
Yes, he was in movies with Charlie Chaplin back in the day. I never saw any of the movies that he was in, but he was a very handsome, very intelligent guy.
I believe the Charlie Chaplin movie was A Night at the Show.
Yes, that's correct.
And then he met his wife, Grace.
Grace was there in California. He met her and wooed her for several years before they got married. He brought her back here to Tulsa.
And he was a driver for this Canadian family who was visiting Los Angeles.
Yes.
And Grace was part of that family.
Yes, that's right.
And that's how he met his future bride.
In fact, I think she may have been engaged to somebody else and broke the engagement because Franklin was quite a charmer.
Grace, you knew her too.
I knew Grace,
And
yes.
so tell us about her a little bit.
Well, Grace was a very proper, dignified lady, and Franklin was too. Franklin was a very suave, dignified person. He didn't easily make friends, but once having made a friendship, he was extremely loyal. And Grace was a very, very proper lady, and just as lovely as she could be.
They were of, we call high society in this town.
Yes, they were.
And very involved in giving to the town at that point, weren't they?
Well, they were. One of the things that they did is they had no children, so they created a mother's milk bank at St. John's Hospital. That way, women could go in and give their breast milk for babies who couldn't stand formula milk. They were the very first ones to do that.
They were involved in the Tulsa Ballet.
They were involved in the ballet. They were involved with Philbrook. Franklin was very much an early pioneer of local society. The Perriott family that had the beautiful big mansion at 31st and Lewis, they were good friends of Foss Perriott and his wife. They were really high society here in Tulsa, members of Southern Hills.
They were also members of the First Presbyterian Church.
He was one of the founders of the foundation for the First Presbyterian Church, which today is worth millions and millions of dollars. He was the first head and creator of their foundation.
Now we see the Bernstein Family Life Center was there, and now this all makes sense to us to see that Bernstein name. And it started with Franklin and Grace because that was their church.
That was their church.
But they died in the 80s, and so obviously they didn't see this happen, but that's what their philanthropy led to.
Well, Franklin had no children. Very early on in my representation, I talked to him about what he wanted to do with his estate. He decided that he would like to leave it into a foundation that would benefit the community. He was so supportive of everything in Tulsa. He had no family to leave it to. So he decided to create the Grace and Franklin Burnson Foundation.
How did he get introduced to you?
Well, a fellow named Steve Pappas had been a friend of his, and Steve Pappas was one of my mentors. He officed on the same floor as my law firm did when we first established with Lewis Mossberg. Steve introduced me to Franklin.
Was that an easy thing to get to know him?
No, because Franklin was a very distinguished person, and he didn't make friends easily, but he was quite wealthy, and we just sat and talked. We became friends, and we talked about his needs from a legal viewpoint. I learned from Steve Pappas that Franklin Burnson didn't pay for legal services. He would pay in other ways. He would make it worth my while to give him assistance in legal matters. So I never, ever rendered a bill to Franklin Burnson for anything.
What does that mean, make it worth your while? How did he do that?
Well, simply by introducing me to people and giving me the benefit of his friendship. I'll explain a little later on how he got Chuck Rittenberry started into a business by guaranteeing a note at the bank. He would just do things for you. For example, one time I went to New York City with a friend of mine to see some shows, and Franklin arranged for the tickets to the shows down front and arranged for me to go to the 21 Club at his expense and have dinner. He was a friend of the owner of the 21 Club, which was a very highbrow, expensive restaurant in New York City.
Did you feel when he made it right by you that it was a fair trade?
Oh, absolutely. Just to be friends with Franklin was an experience because he was such a pillar of the community and so highly thought of.
Well, maybe you also, as a result of your friendship, brought in other business because of that. Would that be correct?
Yes, that would be correct. I was able to introduce him to a fellow named Chuck Rittenberry. Chuck Rittenberry had been a client of mine for several years. Chuck had been engaged with North American Aviation as a contract writer, and he had trained in space matters with Jet Propulsion Labs in California. And he'd come to Tulsa, and he wanted to be an entrepreneur and not be employed by somebody like North American. He came to me with an idea of establishing a hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, which would be for high wealth individuals. And it would only have certain facilities in the hospital that were very lucrative and profitable to the hospital. He'd come up with this plan and studied it and had several partners. He paid for me and one of my partners, Louis Levy, to go to Atlanta, Georgia to make a presentation to a large group of doctors to fund this hospital. Chuck chartered a jet and flew down to Atlanta to meet with us, and we met with the doctors. They had a lot of questions about the hospital, most of which we were able to answer, but they were never able to get off the dime and make a decision about doing this. So that went nowhere. We ended up flying back to Tulsa with Chuck on his chartered jet. And then a few years later, he came to me to establish an oil company called International Hydrocarbons, which he and a partner established to do drilling programs. Chuck had never been in the drilling business before and didn't know anything about the oil business, but he wanted to learn. So I gave him one of my engineering books on how to learn the language of the oil field. And in a week's time, he was able to start putting together drilling programs and trying to sell them to investors. This was never successful. He tried it for several years. I helped him learn the language and the business, but that just didn't go over. And then one day I got a call from Chuck, and he said, I need somebody to back a deal in which I'm going to buy the oil from Saudi Arabia, and I can sell it to, I think it was Union Oil in California. I've got a buyer and I got a seller, and I've got several $100,000 that I can make on this deal if you can get somebody who will guarantee the purchase of the oil. I said, well, that sounds to me like something we could do. So I took him to First National Bank to a fellow named Rob Gilbert and presented this proposal. We had it to where the purchase was locked in at a certain price and the sale was locked in at a certain price, and the shipping costs could be locked in and leave a couple of $100,000 as the margin for Chuck. We needed to get a letter of credit so that the seller of the oil would be assured of payment once it was delivered. Chuck didn't have the capability of getting that. There was about $1 million. So I took him to the First National. Gilbert looked at it and he said, well, I don't see where any company would do this for Chuck. He didn't believe the terms of the deal. So then I took it to National Bank of Tulsa. I had a relationship with Mark Tower. I took it to Mark Tower. He took it to committee, and they were unwilling to do it. I represented a company called Braden Industries in Broken Arrow. They sold winches and windmills. I represented the head of the company, and he said he would do it, but he wanted like 3/4 of the profit. And Chuck wasn't willing to give that up. I could understand that. The guy was just trying to be a Sharpie and cut a deal. So I then went to Franklin Burnson and outlined the transaction. First of all, you had to get a letter of credit for the seller of the crude oil, and then you had to get a letter of credit for the shipper, which is the tanker company. Burnson said, I think we can do this. He said, let me call my friend at Conoco. The president of Conoco was a friend of Burnson's. He called him up and told him what the deal was and asked him if he would be willing to look to the purchaser, a letter of credit from the purchaser. And he said, sure, that's not a problem. So they didn't have to put up a letter of credit for Conoco. They simply had to put up a letter of credit for the shipper. They did that. It was about $1 million. That shipment went through. They bought from Conoco and sold to Arco in California. That deal went through. It took about 30 days for the ship to get from Saudi Arabia to California. Before it arrived, there was another transaction that came up in the same way, and Burnson also funded the letter of credit for that. By the time it arrived in California, there were several $1 million involved. That went just the way it was planned. Rittenberry walked into the Bank of America in California with a check from Arco for the purchase of the crude. They said, what are you doing here? He told them the transaction. They said, well, we can bank that. And thus he established a relationship with Bank of America that would last for the next 5 or 6 years. They never lost a dime on any shipment. What Chuck did was give Franklin Burnson half of the profit from that first cargo. It was about $80,000 he gave to Burnson. And then Chuck gave Burnson a 10% interest in his company and gave me a 10% interest in his company. C.R. Rittenberry and Associates is the name of the company. He went on to continue doing this trading for 4 or 5 more years and became very wealthy as a result of it.
What a story. In the 60s, then, Franklin and Grace would establish a charitable foundation.
Yes, in 1969, they established the Grace and Franklin Burnson Charitable Foundation. It was to be the recipient of essentially 98 or 99% of their estate. They had no children and no other family that they wanted to benefit.
What would you estimate their worth was at that time?
Somewhere approaching $20 million.
That was in 69, so I don't know how you figure that in today's dollars, but it was huge.
It was huge.
So he wanted you to set up this foundation.
Yes.
And this was your first time to do something like that.
Yes, it was.
Was that a big challenge, and how did it go?
Actually, setting up a foundation is fairly easily done. You just follow the Internal Revenue Service regs and guidelines. It's something that not many people were doing back then, but Franklin had no other beneficiaries that he wanted. He was very active in First Presbyterian Church. I had done his estate planning, and at first he was going to leave most of his money outright to the church. And then something happened that he became disappointed with some of the leadership of the church for something they had done and decided that he didn't want to do that. He would rather control the outcome of it through a foundation. So we established that foundation.
What would the mission have been of this foundation?
It was simply to benefit charitable organizations here in Tulsa, including First Presbyterian Church. He was the one who set up the very first foundation that the church itself has today, which is probably worth some $15 or $20 million. That was Franklin's first project to establish that. He had a fondness for Philbrook. He had a fondness for Gilcrease. Tulsa Boys Home, he had always supported that.
And the little lighthouse, I believe.
Yes, in the little lighthouse. The foundation was not to be funded, though, until his death. He continued to make his own contributions and change his mind about things that he wanted done. And he made his wife, Grace, and I the trustees of the foundation from the very beginning. Grace moved into mental incapacity during the latter years of her life and had to be established out at Oral Roberts University, where they cared for her. It appeared for a while that Oral Roberts would receive a substantial benefit from Franklin's estate, but something happened to change his mind along the way. Oral did something that he didn't approve of, and so he changed his estate plan and left it to the trustees who survived him to decide how the foundation would be run.
Grace died in 1982.
Yes.
And then Franklin died in January of 1984.
Right.
He was 91 years old when he died. Were you with him then around that time?
I would see him daily. He was pretty sharp, but he began to decline just at the very end of his career and had to be driven around. But he was very unhappy with First Presbyterian Church's minister at the time. So he wanted to withhold doing much for them at the time, and he left everything into the estate. He had two people on his staff that he felt very high regard for, Howard Mayer and a Paul Peterson. He made them trustees of the foundation along with me. His banker was a gentleman by the name of John Strong, and he was made a trustee, so that after Franklin passed away, all of his estate essentially went to the foundation, approximately $20 million worth. And it was up to Peterson, Mayer, myself, and John Strong to decide how the foundation would be distributed. It has become a perpetual foundation, and we distribute approximately 5% to 7% a year of the foundation proceeds to various charitable organizations within the city of Tulsa or close environs.
When you're considering grants and so forth, and it's been a while since he's been here, but you were with him so much, you think, how would Franklin look at this? How would Franklin view this?
Yes, we do. We knew, of his fondness for the church. First Presbyterian Church has been one of the biggest beneficiaries of the foundation. Philbrook has also, because he was a Philbrook board member, and organizations relating to children. He never had children, but they always had wished they had, so they were very fond of children's organizations like the Little Lighthouse.
If you didn't do anything else in foundation work, and to be around Franklin Bernson, who we find out was quite a remarkable man, you would have said, well, that's good. However, you became involved with Donald W. Reynolds as well.
Yes, I did.
Talk about him and how that relationship with you started.
Donald Reynolds' company is a company called Donray Media Group, and it's headquartered for its administration in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Mr. Reynolds was quite an extraordinary individual. He grew up in Oklahoma City, sold papers on a corner. He earned his way through college. He went to a journalism school, University of Missouri at Columbia. On graduation, he then went into the newspaper business, bought a small paper up in Massachusetts, and sold that about a year later. That wasn't a particular success. And then he moved to Houston and became involved with a gentleman there who got him involved in entrepreneurial activities. The first thing he did was he bought a newspaper in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, and one in Fort Smith, Arkansas. That was the beginning of the Don Ray Media Group. He was a terrific entrepreneur.
Let me just point out, this guy was a worker bee, as the others we've talked about. I understand in high school, he worked in the summers at a meatpacking plant to pay for his studies.
Yes.
You know, when young people listen to these stories, they ought to know that these people worked hard at the very beginning.
Well, he rode on a cruise from the United States taking cattle to Spain, and he saw a castle in Spain that he ultimately modeled his home in Las Vegas after, from his memory from that cattle trip. He was quite an unusual entrepreneur. He was a very bright guy. At the time of his death, he owned perhaps 45 newspapers. He had an outdoor advertising organization called Don Ray Outdoor. They had plants around the country, 10 different locations, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Wichita, and various spots around the country. He even had one in Las Vegas. And that's how he really got into outdoor advertising. He saw an outdoor billboard in Las Vegas, and he wanted space to advertise. He bought the newspaper in Las Vegas, back when Las Vegas was only a town of about 25,000 people. He thought that outdoor advertising was a good way to advertise the newspaper, and he tried to get space on the billboards, and they wouldn't sell it to him. They were sold out. He thought if it was that good a business, he ought to get into that business. So he did. He bought billboards and started the Don Ray Outdoor Advertising Agency. So he was one heck of an entrepreneur.
He didn't live in Tulsa.
No, he didn't. He lived wherever he wanted to live. Don Reynolds had an apartment in Fort Smith. He had a mansion in Las Vegas that he'd built after this castle. It's probably about 30,000 square feet. He had an apartment in Trump Tower in New York City. He had an apartment in Beverly Hills. He had a home on the lake down in Hot Springs. He had 8 or 10 homes around the country. None of them were in his name. They were all in the name of the business. He learned early on how to work with the tax codes and write off as many things as he could. He even had airplanes that belonged to the company, and that's how he got around. He had 2 homes in Hawaii, one in Kona and one in Hilo. Both of those were headquarters for him in Hawaii. He bought the newspapers there. Something happened along the way. He had been represented by an attorney here in Tulsa by the name of Doug Fox. Doug Fox was with the Gable Gottwal's firm, a very fine law firm here.
Well, let me just interrupt here by saying that Mr. Reynolds was using a Tulsa law firm because even though he did not live in Tulsa, he did keep an apartment here, and he had a friend he would visit, and he liked to socialize with Tulsans. Just wanted to explain that. So continue.
Doug decided to get out of the practice of law, and he had represented Reynolds and been on Reynolds' board, but he didn't tell Reynolds that he was doing this. And when he made the move into another company that was going to be an oil company, it upset Reynolds, and yet he left his representation at Doug Fox's law firm for a period of time, but ultimately decided that that wasn't where he wanted to be. So based on their Deloitte Touche accounting firm's recommendations, they interviewed 4 firms, one of which was my firm. I interviewed with his vice president of administration, a fellow named Pat Patterson, who did the first interview with me. And then the second interview was with Fred Smith, who was the executive head of his companies. And then finally I got to meet Reynolds, and we just really hit it off quite well. So they engaged me to represent him.
Describe his personality. What was he like?
Reynolds was a small man. He probably stood 5'6" or 5'7". He was a little heavy, but he was outwardly kind of a jovial dwarf. He would hate that description, but it pretty well describes him. He was a Buddha-looking sort of guy. He was rather heavy and balding, but he ran the tightest ship on his empire you can imagine. Nobody in his organization would ever dare call him anything other than Mr. Reynolds. Mm-hmm. He paid everybody well, but he also paid them what they called a going wage, that if they didn't work out, they could go, and he was happy with it.
Why do you think you two hit it off? Was he very common in the way he was?
Well,
You're very easy to talk to yourself. Was there a sense of humor, you think, that clicked, or what?
I suppose so. We just hit it off quite well. At the time, he was kind of estranged from his board of directors. His previous counsel in the firm that Doug Fox had left had gotten Mr. Reynolds to take off all of the members of his board from his foundation. He had already established a charitable foundation to receive his estate. He had placed this attorney and a stockbroker from New York as the only members of the board of directors of the foundation. And that upset the people that work for him. In time, I talked to him and said, these people have been loyal to you. They've helped you run your business and build it into what it is today. Why wouldn't you trust them to run the foundation when you're gone? And he agreed with that. He put these people who had been on the foundation back on the foundation board to run it in the event of his death. And I think he appreciated my practical approach to things.
Were there sometimes you would disagree with him and you'd stand your ground and he'd understand eventually, come around?
Yes, he was very willing to accept advice. He accepted advice from professionals, and I advised him to put these people back on his foundation board. The simplest thing is I said, you trust them to run your business. You've got them as directors of your business. Why wouldn't you trust them to run your business when you're gone?
Yeah.
So it was a very practical approach, and it's hard to argue with that.
What was his wife's name?
He'd had several wives. He was not married at the time I met him. He had been through 3 fairly unhappy relationships, but had spawned 3 children from 2 different wives. One of the wives got to him financially pretty heavily, so he was not too thrilled about the idea of women. In fact, shortly after I signed on to be his counsel, I was invited to his 60th birthday party in Las Vegas at his mansion, which we call the Castle. 15 or 20 of his old girlfriends, as well as most of his managers of his various businesses, were invited, and a lot of his social friends were invited to his 60th birthday party. He had George Burns engaged to entertain, and the original Ink Spots were also there to entertain at his birthday party. According to his employees who were loyal to him, the real reason was to have all of these women that he had dated from time to time there to see each other and see what he had...
He was kind of bragging, wasn't he?
Yeah, see what he had accumulated.
You would know this. Forbes magazine noted that Reynolds' 3 children would receive trust income of $50,000 a year for life, but would be left only $1 if they unsuccessfully contest his will.
I changed that a little bit. One of the first things that I did for Mr. Reynolds was to look at his estate plan, and he had left a very small percentage to each of his children. I suggested that instead of using a will as the device to transfer his estate, that he ought to create a trust, and that he could create a living trust during his lifetime to manage all of his assets, and then for his assets to pass into the trust estate on his death. And he liked that idea, so we recreated his estate and left a larger portion to each of the children that would provide a trust income for them during their lifetime than what would happen to it on their death. It was still a very small percentage of his estate, probably less than 2 or 3%, because he was worth, at his death, over $1 billion.
Now, did he pay you for your legal services? We talked about Franklin Burnson would make it worth your while. How about Donald?
Yes, he paid, and of course he paid it through the company. I was hired by the Don Ray Media Group with home offices in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Now, Reynolds' home in Las Vegas was the titler headquarters for the company. He lived there and had his office and the office of his chief executive, Fred Smith, there in his home. Las Vegas, of course, had no estate taxes in the event of his death. so that all of his estate would not be taxed there.
You had experience with the Bernstein Foundation, but didn't you go out and investigate a lot of foundations before you set up the Reynolds Foundation?
It's the Reynolds Business Foundation. What he left on his death is where I traveled around. After Reynolds passed away, all of his estate, except the small amounts left to his 3 children, went into the foundation. And that's when I went around and investigated other foundations to see how it should be run.
So that was a foundation you were starting then, that part
the
of it.
foundation was already in existence when I came onto the scene. And the company funded the foundation during its business years while Reynolds was alive.
I note that there was a book you read called Golden Donors.
Yes.
And there were 2 major lessons from that. That the further the foundation got from the donor's death, the more they strayed from what the donor would have approved.
That's exactly right.
Talk about that from your experience.
Well, probably the best experience is the Pugh family. Pugh left most of his estate, which was huge, to a foundation which, after his death, was run by people not in his family. Foundation people tend to go off in their own little world and start spending money on what they deem to be desirable outcomes and not what the founder would really have wanted done. Many of the foundations, the people left behind as trustees, did things that the founder would have turned over in his grave if he had known about it. Reynolds didn't want that to happen, and neither did the people that succeeded to run his estate. So we created a limited life for the Reynolds Foundation of originally 50 years, and then later it was shortened to just 25 years, and that is about to run out. So in the year of 2015, it will cease to exist.
We've got another year here, or about a year and a half.
They will stop making charitable grants, and then we'll go into a slumber for 3 years, and then it will go out of existence, I think, in 2019.
Will it all have been granted then?
It will have all been spent, yes. It's planned to spend out over the next 2 years.
The second lesson you learned from Golden Doors was when power is given to the staff, the faster the foundation moves away from the donor's intentions.
That's correct. Mr. Smith, who ran all of the businesses for Mr. Reynolds, was a quick learner after he read Golden Donors. He has maintained control totally in the board of directors and doesn't let staff dictate policies for the foundation. That has remained true even through today. The trustees are the ones who dictate the policy of the foundation.
But you became executive director of the Reynolds Foundation.
Yes, I did.
What was the foundation's primary focus of their grants?
Well, we wanted to stay small, and one of the admonitions Mr. Smith gave me was to keep it simple. So as I started running the foundation, it was my secretary and myself, and I went and visited other large foundations around the country to see what their focus was. I visited the Kresge Foundation in Michigan and found that they were one of the few foundations in the country that made only capital grants. They would make grants for a small portion of a building, but you had to have a really good program to raise the rest of the money before you earned a grant from Kresge. I also visited the Ewing Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, and I visited another foundation in Chicago. They made what they call smart grants. They would give a lot of money to a handful of people around the country who were outstanding in their professions and let them do with it what they wanted to do. I saw that that was not something that we had an interest in doing. Then I visited a foundation in New York that did large capital grants. I liked the idea that they made grants which would have high impact on an organization, and they would make it for the purposes of building a building or establishing a program that was consistent with good business practices.
The construction of new buildings, that was your main focus.
Yes. The program I established for the Reynolds Foundation in the first year, we would solicit applications to build a building up to $15 million in value, but which exceeds $2 million in value. They would have to show how they would use the money, and it was a grant to completely build and equip and furnish the building and set it in business. And all they had to do was to, during the course of the building project, raise 20% of the amount of money we gave them to act as an endowment to keep the building up and functioning the way it should.
Upon his death, what was his net worth?
Reynolds' net worth on his death was somewhere in excess of $1 billion.
Okay, and you talked about Franklin, and you said that was $29 million, I think,
yes.
when he died. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about $1 billion upon his death, which actually happened on a yacht in the Mediterranean Sea.
That's correct.
In 1993.
Yes.
And he was 86 years old. I have a long list of buildings built, and I'll go through some of them. We have the Donald W. Reynolds Razorback Stadium, the Cancer Support House in Fort Smith, Arkansas, the Donald W. Reynolds Center for Life Sciences at Hendrix College. I would imagine your brain is going, I was involved in all that stuff, right?
Yes.
The Reynolds Center at Harding University, the Performing Arts Center at the University of Oklahoma, the Reynolds Performance Hall at the University of Central Arkansas, Warren, Arkansas, YMCA. I'm kind of jumping here, but of course, we in Tulsa know the Donald W. Reynolds Center at the University of Tulsa.
In addition to that, we have the Boy Scout headquarters here that we built. We have Tulsa Boys Home, which we expanded and established here. We have a food bank here that was totally rebuilt. We have a food bank in Oklahoma City. We have an Oklahoma City Art Museum. We have a health center in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. We have community centers in Durant, Oklahoma, and Seminole, Oklahoma. There are 4 community centers that we've built.
Isn't there a children's facility in Oklahoma? Children's hospital.
That too. That's in Bethany.
Okay, at Children's Hospital in Bethany.
The Children's Center in Bethany has been one of the largest and one of the first grants we ever made, and one of the best we've ever made.
But then he also goes to Washington, D.C. You do, the Donald W. Reynolds Center for American Art and Portraiture.
Yeah, they've received, I don't know the exact number, $30 to $40 million. The first $30 million they received was to keep the portrait of George Washington here in America. It was owned by a British citizen and had been on loan to America, and he decided he needed some money, so he was going to put it up for sale. Fred Smith read about it in the Wall Street Journal and called the Smithsonian and said, we'll put up $30 million to keep the exhibit here and also to travel it around the country for exhibition, which they did. And they built a new exhibit just to keep this Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, which is probably the best piece of art of George Washington there ever is.
I know you must know. And a simple phone call, sometimes a huge deal can be made. We'll give you $30 million. They could say that on the phone.
Yeah.
What it did to those people on the other end of the line.
Well, they caught an airplane to Las Vegas.
Immediately.
Yes.
And then about George Washington, I was there at Mount Vernon Estate myself a couple of years ago, and I didn't realize the Donald W. Reynolds Museum and Education Center there that I went through was built by this foundation.
And subsequently, another facility has been built there that we spent $30 million on. It's a center for the study and preservation of George Washington. It's like a library. It collects all of the papers of George Washington and is right there on the Mount Vernon grounds.
Now, can I ask you about the Reynolds Foundation here in Tulsa? You were so closely tied to TU, a member of the Board of Regents as well. You must have had some influence on that donation.
Well, I did, and Fred Smith, bless his heart, rescued me when I made the presentation to the board about the University of Tulsa. It was different than any other grant we had made because the Reynolds Foundation made grants that covered 100% of the building costs and we didn't want other participants in the construction and equipping of the building. Well, TU had already kicked off construction of their new basketball center and was asking for us to grant $15 million, which was half the cost of the building. And we'd never done a participation before and haven't done since. That was the only one of its kind. And the trustees were a little reluctant to do that since it had already kicked off and was being built. But Fred Smith rescued it and said, I think Reynolds would have liked this.
So again, as you're making these grants, you knew that Donald W. Reynolds was very interested in building buildings, and you carried on that mission.
Yes.
And Fred Smith is still, what's his position?
He's still the chairman of the foundation. He was the president of the company when I started representing Mr. Reynolds. Reynolds finally decided that he had run the company long enough, and I suggested to him that why don't you retire and let Fred run the whole thing? So he did. He let Fred take over as chairman of the board and ultimately become chairman of the foundation.
It was largely just capital grants for buildings. Is that all the foundation did?
No. In addition to the building program, we developed a cardiovascular clinical research program at 4 different medical schools, one of them being Johns Hopkins in Washington, D.C., Harvard Medical School in Boston, Southwestern Medical Institute in Dallas, and Stanford Medical Institute. Those programs were to look into cardiovascular research and try to establish ways in which the heart program could be improved. Then there was a program for aging and quality of life where we have given grants to over 40 medical schools to improve their treatment of the aging. In addition to that, there are the grants that we made to Mount Vernon and to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C.
You know, I got to say, here you are really with foundations and grants and contracts. I can't help but think about the C you got in contracts when you were in school. And that's essentially what you ended up doing.
Yes.
A lot of work in contracts.
Absolutely did. But I learned from him. He taught a lesson.
Who did?
Elbridge Phelps, my professor in contracts.
It's remarkable, the philanthropy of Donald W. Reynolds and Franklin and Grace Burnson that we've been talking about. But it has to give you a lot of good feeling that I know it's not your money, but you are giving advice and you're making suggestions that are good, to know the good that you've helped provide.
Well, it's a great feeling. It's a career in itself that I've engaged in since Franklin passed away in 1984. It's been very fulfilling. Of course, the Reynolds experience was a whole different dimension from the Burnson, but I still am actively involved in Burnson. I'm now retired from Reynolds as of this year.
You were involved personally in Tulsa, too.
Oh, yes.
In various ways.
Well, that helped me establish the Reynolds Foundation and a direction for it because of my experience that I'd had with Burnson. I was able to identify a financial investment advisor for the Reynolds Group, which they use to this day. It also identified a way to proceed with distribution of the assets. It's been most rewarding for me.
You're sitting here with a shirt that says the first tee, Tulsa.
Mm-hmm.
So you have an interest in golf. I suppose it goes back to your father.
Yes.
So are you involved with First Tee?
Well, I support the First Tee. The Burnson Foundation is one of the strong central supporters of the First Tee organization. Burnson Foundation, of course, is restricted to doing things here in Tulsa. We give out $1.5 million to $2 million a year to various organizations. First Tee is one of the ones that we really like a lot.
Well, I want to thank you for this time that you've given us. A remarkable story. Yours is remarkable and interesting in and of itself, and then how you're connected to these people of wealth and how it's made such a major impact in the country and in particular here, too, in Tulsa. Thank you for sharing. And I got to say, you wrote the story of your life, which I used some of this to prompt, but I have never seen anybody write with such detail as you did, and your children have got to be happy. It took you, I think, a year to do this.
Yes, it did.
And maybe that can encourage other people to do the same, but you have such a memory for detail. And I must tell people again, I mean, you are 82 years old, but you're 82 years young.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I hope I can continue to stay involved. I love being involved in the community, and the opportunity that Reynolds and Burnson both have given me to do this kind of work is very rewarding, you can imagine.
Right. Well, thanks for sharing your story here with Voices of Oklahoma. Now many, many people will hear it for generations to come.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You have been listening to the Voices of Oklahoma podcast, stories taken from the oral history website, voicesofoklahoma.com. At the website, you will discover an array of storytellers. Many you will know. Some will be new to you, but all will be worth your time. This work depends on listeners like you, who are interested in learning about the great people of Oklahoma. Our website provides an opportunity to donate to this 501c3 project, which preserves Oklahoma history, one voice at a time. voicesofoklahoma.com.